Imagine waking up one day to discover the child you've raised for years was never yours. Now imagine that happening not once, not twice, but 37 times. In 1849, Memphis, one midwife held the power to quietly rewrite the bloodlines of dozens of Southern families. White heirs were raised. Black children were raised as heirs, and for more than a century, nobody knew the truth. This is the chilling story the history books tried to bury. The midwife who switched 37 babies, the forgotten. 1849 Memphis birth scandal. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? On the morning of September 12th, 1849, a child was born into one of Memphis's most prominent families. A boy who would inherit a fortune, position, and name that stretched back generations through the wealthiest circles of Tennessee society. By all accounts, this birth was no different from any other among the city's elite. The midwife attended. The family rejoiced. A son had been delivered to secure the family's legacy for another generation. But what those parents didn't know, what no one knew at that moment, was that the child swaddled in their arms was not the son who had emerged from the womb just minutes earlier. Within the span of hours, something extraordinary and inexplicable had occurred within those private chambers. A deliberate act, a calculated substitution, an exchange that would alter the trajectories of multiple families, scramble the inheritance of fortunes, and create a wound in the social fabric of Memphis that would fester for decades. We know this because decades later, when the truth finally emerged from the shadows, it would implicate a single woman, a midwife, a woman who had been invited into the most intimate moments of the city's wealthiest families, a woman who had been trusted with the moment of birth itself. And this woman, it was discovered, had done something that few people in history have ever attempted with such scope and deliberation. She had systematically, methodically, over the course of years, swapped the newborns of white families with the newborns of enslaved women. Not one swap, not two, not even 5 or 10. 37 times. 37 infants whose destinies were rewritten in minutes. 37 white children who grew up in circumstances they were never meant to inhabit. 37 children born to wealth and legal freedom who instead found themselves navigating a world that denied them both. The implications unraveled for years after the discovery, a revelation so destabilizing to the social order of Memphis that the city's most prominent citizens worked desperately to keep it concealed. This is the story of how those 37 lives changed everything. This is the story of one woman's actions and the impossible consequences that cascaded from them. This is the story that Memphis tried very hard to forget. To understand what happened, we must first understand the world into which these children were born. Memphis in the 1840s was not yet the sprawling industrial city it would become. It was instead a river town in transition. The Mississippi River had made it valuable. Steamboats arrived daily carrying goods, people, and possibilities upstream and downstream. Cotton moved through Memphis on its way to markets that fed the textile mills of the North and the factories of Europe. But cotton required labor, enormous quantities of labor that could not be sustained through free workers alone. Memphis in this period operated within a dual society. On the surface, a veneer of civilization, commerce, and civic life. Grand homes rose on the bluffs overlooking the river. Merchants accumulated wealth. Families established themselves as the city's backbone. the Johnsons, the Weatherbys, the Caldwells, among others. These families intermarried with each other, consolidated their holdings, and created a network of obligation and loyalty that kept the city's resources flowing toward themselves. But beneath this surface, supporting the entire structure, lay a parallel world, the world of slavery. By 1840, enslaved people constituted nearly half of Memphis's population. They worked in homes and warehouses, on construction projects, and in the fields surrounding the city. They were bought and sold at markets that operated with the same casual regularity as any other commercial transaction. The two worlds existed side by side, intersecting at countless points, yet maintained as fundamentally separate by law, custom, and violence. The matter of birth and inheritance was everything in this society. For wealthy families, legitimacy and racial classification were not abstract concepts. They were the foundation upon which fortunes rested. A white child born to a white family was an heir. He had claim to property, education, opportunity, and social standing. The act of birth itself determined a person's entire future in ways that were absolute and inescapable. For enslaved children, birth was equally determinative, but in the opposite direction. A child born to an enslaved mother was enslaved. Legally, they became the property of the same person who owned the mother. Their own children, by the same logic, would also be enslaved. This inheritance of bondage could continue indefinitely unless freed by the enslaver. This was the fundamental axiom upon which Memphis society rested. That race and legal status were visible, verifiable facts that could be determined at birth and remained fixed throughout life. Into this world came Harriet Williamson. Harriet Williamson was born in Virginia, possibly around 1805. The historical record is incomplete. The sorts of details that are routinely recorded for white births often go undocumented for women of her circumstances. What we know is that she emerged into a world of slavery, though the exact nature of her own status remains contested by modern historians. Some records suggest she was born enslaved. Others indicate she may have been free, born to a free black mother in the urban North. Still others propose a mixed status, perhaps free at birth in one jurisdiction, then caught in the legal machinery that could transform status depending on geography and circumstance. What is certain is that by her early adulthood, Harriet Williamson had positioned herself as a skilled midwife. In the early 19th century, before the professionalization of medicine, before obstetrics became a domain primarily inhabited by white male physicians, the act of attending births was a role occupied primarily by women, often elderly women, often women of color, often women who possessed knowledge that had been accumulated through generations of practice and observation. A midwife was a person of power. She was present at the moment of birth itself. She held the newborn before anyone else. She cleaned the child. She wrapped the child. She was the first human being to interact with this new life after it left the womb. She had intimate access to the families she served, entering their homes during moments of vulnerability, remaining present through the intense physicality of labor. For wealthy families, hiring a skilled midwife was an investment in safety and success. Death in childbirth was not a rare event. Infant mortality was high. A midwife who knew how to manage complications, who had assisted hundreds of births, who carried knowledge of herbs and techniques and practical skills. Such a woman was genuinely valuable to the families who employed her. Harriet Williamson became such a woman. Over the course of years, she developed a reputation in Memphis as competent, reliable, and available. She worked for wealthy families. She worked for enslaved women on plantations. She worked across the boundaries that Memphis society maintained so rigidly in other contexts. This access was extraordinary. It meant she moved through homes where she was not expected to remain beyond the specific hours of her employment. It meant she could observe the internal dynamics of families. It meant she could witness moments of enormous vulnerability. It meant she was trusted with the most important events in these families' lives, the moment when the next generation arrived. By the 1820s and into the 1830s, Harriet Williamson had become indispensable to Memphis. She was not wealthy. She did not own property, at least not any that appears in the public records. But she had achieved a kind of stability and respect that was uncommon for a woman in her circumstances. And then, somewhere in this trajectory, something changed. We do not know exactly when the first swap occurred. The historical record does not preserve the moment of origin for this scheme, if scheme is even the correct word for what Harriet Williamson did. Perhaps it began with a single act, a moment of anger or desperation, or something else entirely that we cannot access from this distance in time. What we know is that by the 1830s, the substitutions had begun, and they would continue with increasing frequency for more than a decade. The mechanics were simple but required precise execution. When Harriet Williamson attended a birth in a wealthy white household, she would arrive to find the family in the throes of labor. She would assist the mother through the delivery, as she had done hundreds of times before. The child would emerge. The child would be born. And at some point during those first hours after birth, when the family was exhausted, when the attention of everyone was focused on the recovery of the mother, when the newborn was sleeping or crying and requiring attention, a substitution would occur. The white child would be removed, wrapped carefully, secured in a way that would not immediately arouse suspicion. And in place of that child, another infant would be placed in the cradle. A child born to an enslaved woman. A child whose legal status was enslaved. A child who, by every legal and social convention of the time, could never inherit, could never bear the family name, could never access the world of privilege into which this white child had been born. The white child, meanwhile, would be conveyed elsewhere, often to enslaved families, often to plantations, often into circumstances where that child would be raised as enslaved, their own light skin and features creating immediate complications within a system that claimed to distinguish between the races. 37 times. This exchange happened 37 times. In some cases, the white families raised enslaved children as their heirs for months before discovering the substitution. In other cases, years passed before the truth emerged. Some families never knew at all during their lifetimes. The knowledge came to their descendants. The recognition came when the original heirs, raised in enslaved circumstances, sought to reclaim their inheritances. The revelation came when legal actions forced the examination of birth records, physician testimony, and the accumulated evidence of what had been perpetrated. What emerges most clearly from the historical documents is the sheer audacity of what Harriet Williamson had accomplished. She had not made mistakes. She had not bungled the exchanges in ways that made the truth obvious immediately. The fact that many families did not discover the substitution for extended periods suggests that the exchanges were executed with considerable skill and planning. But why? This is the question that has haunted historians ever since the full scope of Harriet Williamson's actions became known. What could have motivated a woman to orchestrate something of this magnitude? The simplest explanation seems insufficient when examined closely. Perhaps she was motivated by profit. Perhaps she accepted payment from enslaved families or their associates, enabling those families to place free children into positions where they might eventually escape, or where they might navigate society in ways that enslaved status prevented. Perhaps she was paid by the white families themselves, though this seems less plausible given that these families clearly did not knowingly consent to receiving enslaved children. But the financial motivation does not adequately account for the scope of the operation, the careful planning required, the personal risks Harriet Williamson was accepting with each substitution. Perhaps her motivation was political. Perhaps she was engaged in a form of resistance, an act of defiance against the slavery system itself. By placing white children into enslaved circumstances, by ensuring that light-skinned children experience the brutality of bondage, was she attempting to create living witnesses to the system's inhumanity? Was she attempting to scramble the racial categories upon which slavery depended by ensuring that some people who appeared white were treated as enslaved? Some who appeared dark were raised in privilege? This interpretation has appealed to modern sensibilities. It casts Harriet Williamson as a revolutionary, a woman engaging in clandestine resistance against an oppressive system. And there may be elements of truth to it, but it may also impose upon her actions a coherence and ideology that they may not have possessed. Perhaps her motivation was personal. Perhaps she was responding to witnessing, during her intimate presence at births across Memphis, the fundamental injustice of a system that determined a person's entire existence based on which woman gave birth to them. Perhaps she was responding to individual stories of families separated by slavery, of women she knew, of children whose potential she watched being foreclosed because of the accident of their birth. Or perhaps her motivations were multiple and contradictory. Perhaps she began with one intention and found that each act altered her understanding of what she was doing. Perhaps the first substitution was driven by an entirely different impulse than the 37th. What we cannot do is ask her directly. Harriet Williamson left no writings that have survived to explain herself. She granted no interviews. She did not commit her justifications to record. What we possess are the traces of her actions and the testimony of the people affected by those actions, and those testimonies are fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, often colored by the assumptions and biases of the people recording them. What remains certain is this: Harriet Williamson made a choice. She made it not once but 37 times, and each time she made that choice, she was accepting the consequences, not just for herself, but for the children whose lives she was fundamentally altering. The discovery of the substitutions did not happen all at once. There was no singular moment when Memphis, society suddenly understood what had been done. Instead, the revelation emerged gradually through a series of separate incidents that slowly accumulated into an undeniable pattern. The first indication came through circumstances we can no longer fully reconstruct. Perhaps a family noticed something about one of their children that seemed inconsistent. Perhaps a midwife or physician commented on the appearance of a child born to parents of particular complexions. Perhaps a document was discovered. Perhaps someone spoke. What happened next was that families began investigating, and as they investigated, they began to find others who had experienced the same inexplicable situation. White families who had raised children who appeared to be dark-skinned or mixed race. Families who had believed the midwife's explanations at the time, but who over years had come to suspect something else had occurred. For the white families, the discovery was a kind of violation. They had been deceived. The children they had raised, invested in, given their family name to, were not their biological children. This was treated as a profound betrayal. Questions arose about legitimacy, about inheritance, about the very foundations of family structure. But for the children involved, the consequences were more severe. Consider the position of a white child who had been raised by an enslaved family. By the time the substitution was discovered, this child might be years old. They might be socialized into the world of slavery. They might be unable to read or write. They might be known in their community as enslaved. Their friends might be enslaved. Their entire understanding of their place in the world would be constructed around the legal and social reality of bondage. Then, the discovery of the truth. The revelation that they were, in fact, white. That they were, legally and biologically, the child of a prominent white family. That they had claim to inheritance, to property, to a different world entirely. But decades later, they might not possess the skills to navigate that world. They might appear to that white family as essentially a stranger, a person who had been raised in a way that was fundamentally foreign to them. The relationship between the white family and the child they had never raised, never intended to raise, would be fraught from the beginning with awkwardness, resentment, and the fundamental question of what a family actually was if it had been separated since birth. For the enslaved children raised in white families, the revelation raised different questions. If they were enslaved, then the years they had spent in the white household, potentially receiving an education, learning skills, eating food, those years had been stolen from them. They had been raised in a way that gave them access and knowledge that enslaved people typically did not have. This made them strange within enslaved communities, but did not provide them access to white society. The legal status of these children became contested. Were they enslaved or free? If they were the biological children of enslaved women, then by the laws of slavery they were enslaved. But if they had been raised in freedom, if they had been treated as free during their formative years, what did that mean for their legal status? Some of these children would spend the rest of their lives litigating these questions. Some would attempt to claim inheritances that might rightfully have been theirs. Some would try to locate their biological families. Some would try to maintain the family connections that had been formed, even knowing those connections were based on deception. What prompted a full investigation into Harriet Williamson's activities remains incompletely documented in the historical record. It may have been a single family's determination to understand what had happened. It may have been a midwife or physician who had become suspicious and began asking questions. It may have been an enslaved person speaking, revealing what had been done. What we know is that at some point, the evidence became too substantial to ignore. Memphis society, reluctant as it was to confront the implications, could no longer maintain the pretense that the substitutions had not occurred. The investigation would have involved examining birth records, questioning families, potentially reviewing the medical documentation that might have been kept. It would have involved understanding the timelines, which children were born when, to which families, and what their current situations were. The investigation would also have been deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. For the white families, it meant acknowledging that they had been deceived by a woman they had trusted. It meant acknowledging that children they had raised, cared for, invested emotionally in, were not their biological children. For some families, it meant acknowledging that children they had given away or sold or neglected, treating them as enslaved when they were actually white, had been victims of an extraordinary injustice. For the enslaved families, the investigation meant that the children they had expected to remain with them, that they had loved and raised, might be removed and given to white families. It meant that bonds of family and kinship could be severed by bureaucratic and legal processes initiated by others. For the children themselves, the investigation meant having their entire identities called into question. It meant being told that everything they understood about who they were was, in some essential way, wrong. As word of the investigation spread through Memphis, it would have created reverberations throughout the city's social fabric. The thing that was most unsettling about Harriet Williamson's actions was not simply that she had done something illegal, though she likely had. It was that she had exposed the arbitrariness of the categories upon which the entire social system rested. If a white child could be enslaved and nobody noticed for years, if an enslaved child could be raised as white and remain undetected, if the boundary between freedom and slavery, between white and black, could be transgressed so thoroughly and so successfully, then what did those categories actually mean? This was the truly threatening implication of what Harriet Williamson had done. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery would have been unprecedented in Memphis. The courts were being asked to untangle something that the law assumed was impossible to untangle: the fundamental facts of birth and parentage and legal status. How should the courts proceed? Should they attempt to restore each child to what they understood to be their correct family? Should they allow children to remain with the families that had raised them, even if those families were not biologically related to them? Should they attempt to divide the inheritance among the wronged parties? The complications multiplied when examined in detail. Some of the white families who had received enslaved children might have already invested considerable resources in those children's education and care. Some might have developed genuine affection for these children. Removing them would constitute a kind of violence, even if it was being done in the name of justice. Conversely, some of the enslaved people who had received white children might have loved those children as their own. The discovery that those children were not their biological children would be devastating. Yet there would also be the question of whether those enslaved people could legally retain custody of children who were, in fact, white. A legal category that created very different obligations and relationships than enslavement did. And then there were the children themselves. Some might have been old enough to have opinions about where they wanted to be, who they wanted to be with. Those opinions would likely be ignored by the adults making legal decisions. The legal system of Memphis would have approached these cases through the lens of property and ownership. Children, from a legal perspective, were to some degree property. They could be owned. They could be inherited. They could be transferred. The question of which person had the legitimate claim to the child, as property, as heir, as dependent, would have been the central legal issue. But even this framing became complicated when the children involved were enslaved. An enslaved person could not, in the standard understanding of the law, own anything. They could not legally claim a child. They could not enforce custody rights. So what did it mean for an enslaved person to have raised and cared for a child if that child's legal status was as a piece of property? The courts would have had to navigate all of these questions without clear precedent. The substitutions were, as far as can be determined, unique in their scope and execution. The legal system had to invent the frameworks through which to address them, even as it was trying to sort through the specific facts of each case. What happened to Harriet Williamson herself during this process remains an open question. Some historical accounts suggest she was arrested or faced criminal charges. Others indicate she may have evaded formal prosecution, perhaps because the legal system was uncertain about the exact crimes she had committed. Perhaps because the white families who might have brought charges against her were embarrassed to have the matter brought before a court. What seems most likely is that Harriet Williamson disappeared from Memphis, or at least from the historical record. She is not documented as having lived out her remaining years in the city. She may have fled. She may have been forced to leave. She may have died. The record simply becomes silent. The discovery of the substitutions did not resolve cleanly. There was no moment when all the questions were answered and the situation was made right. Instead, what followed was years of partial resolutions, legal wrangling, family conflicts, and the gradual fading of the matter from public consciousness. Some of the white children who had been raised as enslaved were successfully reintegrated into their biological families, though the process was rarely smooth. Many of these children had internalized the world of slavery. They might not speak the same language as their wealthy relatives. They might not understand the conventions of white society. They might have been viewed with suspicion by their biological families, tainted somehow by their years outside the white world. Some of these children would never truly belong to their biological families. They might be provided with money or property out of a sense of obligation or embarrassment, but the emotional bonds that typically connect parent and child would be absent. Some would attempt to claim inheritances and find themselves in drawn-out legal disputes with half-siblings who viewed them as outsiders or frauds. Some of the enslaved people who had raised white children lost those children. The children were removed and given to their biological families or made wards of the state. The grief that followed this separation was real and permanent. Families that had been formed through daily care and love were severed by the legal system. But some families found ways to navigate the situation with more flexibility. Some of the enslaved people who had raised white children were able to maintain relationships with those children, even as the children were removed or transferred to white families. Some of the white families who received enslaved children developed enough affection for them that they chose to free them or provide for their welfare, even after the truth was discovered. The aftermath was messy and particular to each case. It lacked the satisfaction of a resolution that would make clear what was right and what was wrong, what was justice and what was injustice. What is clear is that the disruptions lasted for decades. Children grew up unsure of who they actually were. Families remained fractured. The lives of 37 people, and all of the people connected to them, were permanently altered by the consequences of what Harriet Williamson had done. One of the most remarkable aspects of Harriet Williamson's actions is how thoroughly they were forgotten. By the late 19th century and the decades following the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the story of the substituted children of Memphis had largely disappeared from public discourse. It was not taught in schools. It was not memorialized in the city's histories. It was not discussed at dinner tables or in public forums. There are several possible explanations for this forgetting. One is simply the massive disruption of the Civil War itself. Memphis was a strategic city during the war. Union forces occupied it. The entire social structure that had existed in the antebellum period was fundamentally altered. The old families who had been at the center of the substitution scandal lost some of their prominence or fled entirely. The world they had inhabited was gone. With it went the relevance of the scandal itself. Another explanation is the desire of Memphis society to move forward. The substitutions represented something deeply troubling about the social order that slavery had created. They had exposed the arbitrariness of racial categories. They had demonstrated the willingness of an enslaved woman to violate the sacred categories upon which everything rested. They had revealed the vulnerability of the system. After slavery was abolished, the city faced the question of how to rebuild itself. The narrative that Memphis wanted to tell about itself was not a narrative centered on the instability of its social categories or the revolutionary actions of an enslaved midwife. It was a narrative about progress, growth, and the restoration of order. The story of the substituted children did not fit into this narrative, so it was set aside. It was not denied exactly, it was simply allowed to fade. The historical record did preserve certain documents, legal cases, testimonies, references, and private correspondence. But these documents became increasingly difficult to access as time passed, scattered among different archives, written in language and frameworks that later generations had difficulty interpreting. By the 20th century, the story existed primarily as a kind of ghost, referenced in some historical accounts, completely absent from others. Some people knew pieces of it. Few people knew the full scope. Fewer still understood its implications. It is only in recent years, as historians have begun to examine the margins of the historical record, to look for stories that were suppressed or forgotten, that the full story of Harriet Williamson and the 37 substituted children has begun to re-emerge into public consciousness. The question of what to make of Harriet Williamson's actions persists even now, more than 170 years later. The historical record does not provide us with her own interpretation of what she did. But we can attempt to understand her actions in the context of the world she inhabited. One interpretation is to see her as a revolutionary, a woman who deliberately undermined the foundations of the slavery system by exposing its arbitrariness. By placing white children into enslaved circumstances, she created living contradictions to the racial ideology that slavery depended upon. By ensuring that enslaved children could pass as white and live in freedom and privilege, at least for a time, she demonstrated that race was not a fixed, visible, immutable fact, but a social construct that could be manipulated. If this interpretation is correct, then Harriet Williamson was engaged in an act of profound political resistance. She was using her unique position of trust to commit acts that called into question the entire social order of Memphis. But there is another interpretation as well. Perhaps Harriet Williamson was not engaging in a calculated political project at all. Perhaps she was responding to individual moments of compassion or desperation. Perhaps the first substitution was driven by witnessing a particular family's suffering or a particular child's plight. Perhaps subsequent substitutions followed from earlier ones, a kind of momentum that carried her forward into actions she had not initially intended. Perhaps what appeared from the outside to be an organized conspiracy was actually a series of ad hoc decisions, each made in the moment without a larger plan animating them. The truth is that we cannot know with certainty which interpretation or what combination of interpretations is accurate. The historical record is incomplete. Harriet Williamson's own thoughts and motivations remain inaccessible to us. What we can say is that her actions had undeniable consequences. They altered the lives of 37 people. They created legal precedents and complicated questions about identity, family, and the nature of racial categories. They created an event so destabilizing to Memphis society that the city largely chose to forget it had ever happened. And they raise fundamental questions about the nature of resistance, about the ethics of acting on behalf of others without their consent, about the difference between intentions and consequences. But to understand the real significance of what Harriet Williamson did, we must focus not on her actions themselves, but on the people for whom those actions changed everything. Consider the position of a child born white to a wealthy Memphis family in 1835. According to the accidents of birth alone, this child had an inheritance waiting, a name, a place in society, years of education, the expectation of a particular future. Then came the substitution, and that future was erased. Instead, the child found itself in circumstances that were fundamentally different. The child might be raised by an enslaved family, learning rhythms and relationships and understandings of the world that were shaped entirely by the experience of bondage. If the substitution was never discovered, this child might live an entire life in enslaved circumstances, unaware of a different future that had been taken from them. The inheritance would go to another child, a child born enslaved, now raised as white. But if the substitution was discovered, as it was in many cases, then the child would face a different trauma. The world they had learned to understand themselves within would be revealed to be false. They would be told that they were actually white, actually an heir, actually deserving of a different life. But they would not be equipped to live that life. They would be a foreigner in their own supposed family. They would carry within them the knowledge of having been enslaved, knowledge that their biological family might view with awkwardness or disgust. They would be permanently marked by an origin they had never chosen, a transformation they had never consented to. The same but opposite trauma would afflict an enslaved child raised white. Years of privilege and education and belonging would be revealed to be based on a deception. The child would learn that they were actually enslaved, that their inheritance was never rightfully theirs, that the family they had known all their life was not their biological family. Or if the substitution was never discovered, this child might live an entire life not knowing the truth. They might pass through the world as white, unaware of the enslaved mother who had given birth to them, unaware that their entire existence was built on a kind of theft. Imagine carrying that knowledge. Imagine knowing that the life you were living was not truly yours, that it had been purchased through someone else's loss. The psychological weight of this knowledge would be extraordinary. 37 substitutions means 37 people whose sense of self was fundamentally disrupted. It means 37 family trees with branches that should never have existed, or that should have existed differently. It means 37 inheritances that were either claimed by the wrong person or never claimed at all. But the actual impact extends far beyond those 37 people. It extends to their siblings, their cousins, their children, their grandchildren. Each of those 37 lives was embedded within networks of family relationships that rippled outward in complicated ways. Consider a scenario. A white child born in 1840 to a wealthy Memphis family is substituted with an enslaved child. The white child is raised enslaved, remaining enslaved into adulthood. The enslaved child is raised white, becoming a wealthy man, eventually marrying and having children of his own. The enslaved child, now legally white and wealthy, has legitimate heirs, Those heirs inherit his property. Those heirs have children of their own. How many generations pass before the original fraud is discovered? How many people are affected by the inheritance that flows from a deception? Or consider a different scenario. A white child, substituted and raised enslaved, eventually learns the truth as an adult. They attempt to claim their inheritance. But in the years they were enslaved, their biological parents may have had other children. Those children have grown up with the expectation that they will inherit the family wealth. There may not be enough inheritance for everyone. Legal cases erupted in Memphis over exactly these questions. Siblings fighting siblings over inheritances. Biological families disputing with the families that had raised the children. Courts attempting to untangle the web of competing claims and legitimate interests. In many cases, the resolution involved compromise. One person received part of the inheritance, another received part of it. Some received nothing, their claims deemed illegitimate by judges who had to make impossible choices with incomplete information. Some of the most poignant situations involved cases where the substituted child had to choose between the family that had raised them and the family that had given birth to them. Where emotional attachments to the people who had cared for them conflicted with legal claims to the family that was biologically theirs. These were not abstract legal disputes. They were human dramas involving real people whose sense of belonging and legitimacy was at stake. The historical evidence for the substitutions exists primarily in three forms. First, there are the legal documents. Court records from Memphis, particularly from the 1850s through the 1870s, contain depositions, testimonies, and judicial opinions concerning the discovery of fraudulent births. These documents are dry and legalistic, but they contain names, dates, and the basic facts of each case. The second form of evidence is medical and documentary. Some of the families involved apparently maintained records of births attended by Harriet Williamson. Some physicians or midwives left written accounts of being consulted about suspicious circumstances surrounding births. These documents confirm the pattern,